All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're going to trace the deeply fascinating, completely transformative 347-year arc of the British presence in India. This is a story that goes from the initial arrival of a profit-driven corporation to the total conquest of a subcontinent, all the way to the birth of two independent but fiercely fractured nations. It's a massive span of history, but we're going to break down exactly how it all happened.
To make sense of all this, we're going to follow a pretty clear roadmap. First up, the East India Company. Then, the drain of wealth. Third, Britain's colonial railways. Next, the strategy of divide and conquer. And finally, Jinnah and the partition.
So, kicking things off with Section 1, the East India Company, Corporate Conquest.
Back in 1600, the East India Company, or the EIC, was formed by a royal charter just to trade, right? They set up their first factory in Surat around 1608. But the real turning point, the game changer, is 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. Leveraging its immense wealth and superior weaponry, the company basically grabbed direct control over Bengal, which was one of India's richest regions. Over the next 2.5 centuries, the EIC weaponized this trade monopoly to seize absolute political and military control. It's wild when you think about it. They were acting way more like a heavily armed nation than a business, at least until the British Crown formally took over in 1858.
Now you might be wondering, how on earth does a single company swallow an entire subcontinent? Well, they were absolutely brilliant at exploiting local divisions through policies like the doctrine of lapse. If there was a lapse in leadership or a civil conflict, the British would swoop in, offering military support to one side, but there was a catch. In exchange, they'd install their own employees as tax collectors. They also just outright annexed states that didn't have a natural heir. By using ruthless tools like this, the company made sure local rulers were so buried in debt and British taxes that they could never afford to fund any kind of resistance.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the drain of wealth, following the money.
Because, let's be real, at the end of the day, the East India Company was driven by its shareholders. Economist Utsa Patnaik actually ran the numbers on this and estimates that an unfathomable £9.2 trillion was drained from India to Britain during the colonial period. $9.2 trillion. India went from a land of wealthy, self-sufficient communities to a land of impoverished farmers. This massive, systematic wealth transfer is what financed Britain's capitalist development and early industrialization, all while Indian farmers were literally forced off their lands to grow cash crops purely for British export.
So how do you actually extract that much wealth? Basically, it came down to 3 steps. First, they squeezed punishingly high taxes and land revenues from the local population. Second, they set up a system of home charges, which essentially forced India to pay for the British administration, the military, and even the dividends of EIC shareholders. Talk about adding insult to injury. Third, they engineered massive trade imbalances. The British systematically destroyed India's highly advanced textile, steel, and shipbuilding industries, forced them to export cheap raw materials, and then made them buy back manufactured goods at a huge premium. They literally took the industry out of India.
The crazy part? This wasn't some huge secret. One British government official plainly stated the goal was to make the whole Indian nation subservient and taxed to the utmost limit. Early Indian leaders, like Dadabhai Naoroji in his incredibly important book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, hit the nail on the head. He correctly identified this systematic drain as the root cause of India's economic deindustrialization. This relentless extraction completely ruined the purchasing power of everyday Indians, leading directly to devastating famines where millions starved in what is literally one of the most fertile regions on Earth.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, Britain's colonial railways, the Iron Network.
Now, to transport all of those extracted raw materials to the ports, the British needed serious infrastructure, which brings us to the 1853 introduction of the railways. And this brilliantly illustrates the dual edge of colonial infrastructure. See, the railways were a nakedly military project designed to move troops and funnel goods. While Europeans traveled in world-class luxury, the Indian masses were crammed into absolute squalor in third-class cars. Even the financing was deeply messed up. For example, the Bengal-Nagpur line was funded by the incredibly wealthy Rothschild family back in Britain, but their profits were guaranteed by extra taxes levied on the absolute poorest local peasants.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Those very same railways had massive unintended consequences. Despite figures like Mahatma Gandhi fiercely criticizing those squalid third-class conditions, which, by the way, he chose to travel in himself, the railways inadvertently laid the physical foundation for a united independence movement. By physically connecting a previously vast and separated populace, they enabled cheap mass travel, they sparked the trade union movement, and they fostered a truly unified sense of Indian nationalism. The exact tool built for colonial control became a powerful vehicle for resistance.
And that brings us to Section 4, Divide and Conquer, Fracturing the Subcontinent.
So as this interconnected nationalism really started growing after the Crown took direct control in 1858, the British realized they had a serious math problem on their hands. At times, they had only 6,000 administrators and 70,000 British soldiers trying to rule over hundreds of millions of Indians. So to prevent a unified rebellion, they aggressively leaned into a strategy of divide and conquer. They actively pitted Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs against one another. They'd allocate plantation jobs to specific religious groups just to force competition. They controversially partitioned Bengal. They even engineered the military to be 50% Muslim, despite Muslims making up only 20% of the population, which essentially made them the visible face of tax collection in Hindu villages. They even weaponized the local caste system to prevent any kind of unified leadership from forming.
Which sets up our final chapter, Section 5, Jinnah and the Partition, the two-nation theory.
This deliberate, decades-long fracturing really set the stage for the tragic political climax of the 1940s. Enter Muhammad Ali Jinnah, revered today in Pakistan as the Quaid-e-Azam, or Great Leader. His political evolution is fascinating. What's truly remarkable is that this secular, whiskey-drinking, Savile-Row suit-wearing lawyer was originally one of the strongest advocates for Hindu-Muslim unity. I mean, early in his career, he actually orchestrated the 1916 Lucknow Pact, which successfully brought the Muslim League and the Hindu-majority Indian National Congress together to present a united front to the British.
But fast forward to 1940, and things had totally flipped. Over the 1920s and 30s, Jinnah was increasingly marginalized by Gandhi. Gandhi brought this much more spiritual, populist sensibility to Indian politics, and it was a style Jinnah deeply resented. Fearing that an independent democratic India would just result in a Hindu-dominated government where Muslims were a permanent oppressed minority, Jinnah completely shifted his ideology. Declaring it was either India divided or India destroyed, he fully embraced the two-nation theory. He started arguing that Hindus and Muslims weren't just different religions, but fundamentally distinct nations that demanded separate homelands.
By 1946, these tensions are literally boiling over into horrifying civil disturbances, like the Great Calcutta Killing. Feeling totally unable to manage the escalating violence, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee accelerated their withdrawal timeline. So, what did the British do? They brought in a barrister named Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a guy who had famously never traveled further east than Paris in his entire life, to hastily draw the borders of partition based crudely on religious majority areas. And in August 1947, this single line abruptly created the independent nations of India and Pakistan.
The fallout from this hasty, poorly planned withdrawal? It was the greatest mass movement of humanity in recorded history, and the human cost was just catastrophic. 12 million refugees were suddenly displaced overnight, crossing these new, arbitrary borders in absolute terror. Somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people lost their lives in the ensuing communal violence, and an estimated 80,000 women were abducted. The birth of these two independent nations was quite literally baptized in unimaginable tragedy.
So, looking back at this incredible 347-year journey, from the arrival of a profit-hungry East India Company through centuries of immense wealth extraction down to a deliberate strategy of division that culminated in the fracturing of the subcontinent, we have to look at the modern world. India and Pakistan, born from this very partition, have since fought 3 wars and remain locked in a tense nuclear-armed rivalry. So I leave you with this to chew on. How deeply does the legacy of British colonial rule and those crude lines drawn in 1947 continue to threaten and shape global geopolitics today? Think about that and keep exploring.